On a cold morning in May 1536, Anne Boleyn ascended the scaffold erected in the Tower of London's Inner Ward. Clad in a modest grey gown, her hair undone from the crown it had once worn, she stood before a crowd that had gathered not merely to witness a death, but to watch power reassert itself through ritual humiliation. The law of England demanded one last act of submission. A queen who had been crowned must, even in her final moments, publicly thank those who had condemned her. This cruel formality was not mercy, it was mastery. Anne's throat tightened, her hands clasped, and she bowed her head in gratitude to the executioner and the king's men. This was the paradox of absolute authority, to command the dying to thank the hands that delivered their death. What does it mean, then, when justice insists upon gratitude from the condemned, when the body most betrayed must become the stage for obedience? Anne's final act was not only surrender, it was a performance that blurred the lines between ruler and victim, justice and spectacle. Her forced gratitude stands as a symbol of Tudor power's intricate cruelty, where mercy is controlled, voices are silenced, and even death is choreographed to serve the state's narrative. To understand how a queen fell from favor so rapidly and was made to thank her killers, we must peel back the layers of ambition, religion, and betrayal that marked her meteoric rise and devastating fall. Anne Boleyn was not born to royal blood, but she was steeped in the courts of Europe, educated in France and the Netherlands, fluent in languages and versed in Renaissance ideas. Her arrival at Henry VIII's English court was not merely as a lady-in-waiting, but as a figure of intrigue, charm, and intellect. Henry, desperate for a male heir and emboldened by his break with Rome, saw in Anne a chance to rewrite the kingdom's religious and political order. Anne's influence was immediate and profound. She refused to become a mere mistress. She demanded marriage. Her ambition was inseparable from her faith, a Protestant reformist zeal that challenged not only papal authority, but the very structure of English society. Her ascent triggered seismic shifts, the dissolution of monasteries, the realignment of noble factions, and a kingdom torn between old and new orders. Yet her position was precarious. Enemies surrounded her, the traditionalists who saw her as an upstart, the foreign diplomats wary of England's shifting allegiances, and courtiers jealous of her sway. Her charisma was both her shield and her target. To rise so swiftly was to invite ruin, and in a court where loyalty was transactional and power absolute, Anne's very existence became a threat to those who sought to control the king and the country. Anne Boleyn's downfall was less the work of one event and more the slow, deliberate unraveling of a fragile web of alliances. In the shadowed corridors of Henry VIII's court, enemies gathered like vultures. The king's once unshakable affection for Anne began to falter, undermined by his desperate desire for a male heir and the increasing pressure from powerful factions opposed to her influence. Thomas Cromwell, the king's chief minister, saw her not as a queen, but as a liability, a woman whose reformist ideals threatened the status quo and whose volatile temper challenged his own rising power. The charges levied against Anne were grave, yet suspiciously convenient: adultery, incest, treason. The accusations were likely fabricated, relying on coerced testimonies and forged evidence designed to sever her ties to the throne and justify her execution in the eyes of a deeply religious but politically charged society. Behind the scenes, Cromwell orchestrated a campaign that turned even those closest to Anne against her. The court became a theatre of whispers and betrayals, where loyalty was a commodity and survival demanded participation in the purge. Anne's trial was a legal spectacle meant to break not only her body, but her spirit. She faced a jury of nobles, many of whom had personal or political grievances, under a regime that had already decided her fate. The charges, though serious, lacked credible proof, but in the Tudor justice system, verdicts were often predetermined by the Crown's will. Her defense was constrained, her dignity under assault. Yet, even amid this, Anne held her composure, displaying a mixture of defiance and resignation that only deepened her tragic stature. This slow-motion collapse from favored queen to condemned woman was not just a personal tragedy, it was a political purge. Anne's removal cleared the path for Henry to remarry and consolidate his religious reforms without opposition. But it also revealed the precariousness of power, especially for a woman whose ascent depended on the capricious affection of a king and the volatile dynamics of court politics. The moment Anne Boleyn was seized, the shifting tides of court power became a tidal wave, crashing down upon her. Her arrest was swift and unexpected, orchestrated with ruthless efficiency by the king's agents under Cromwell's direction. The palace, once a place of adulation, became a prison, and the once proud queen found herself confined within the cold, unyielding walls of the Tower of London. This was no mere detention. It was the beginning of a psychological war, waged in silence and shadows, where hope was strangled before mercy could be offered. Inside the tower, Anne was isolated from her allies and stripped of the privileges her crown had granted. The chamber where she awaited trial was sparse and unwelcoming, its walls steeped in the echoes of countless condemned souls. The physical conditions, damp stone, limited light, constant surveillance, were designed to erode the spirit as much as the body. But worse than the solitude was the creeping awareness that her fate was sealed. The courtiers who once bowed before her now passed with averted eyes or whispered malice beyond her hearing. Her mental resilience was tested beyond measure. Each day brought interrogations, accusations, and betrayals. She was pressured to confess and to implicate others, especially Queen Catherine Parr, who was rumoured to share some of Anne's reformist sympathies. Anne refused, refusing to grant her tormentors the satisfaction of a false confession or the ruin of innocent friends. This refusal made her a symbol of defiance, but it also hardened the resolve of those determined to see her destroyed. Anne's imprisonment was not only a physical confinement, but an assault on her identity. Stripped of title, companionship, and certainty, she confronted the terror of erasure. Yet even in the darkest hours, she found solace in prayer and scripture, clinging to faith as both shield and sword. The days before her trial passed slowly, each moment a negotiation between despair and dignity. Anne Boleyn's trial was a carefully scripted spectacle disguised as justice, a theatre staged not to uncover truth but to validate a predetermined sentence. Held in Westminster Hall before a jury comprised mostly of nobles, hostile or indifferent to her, the trial was a formal exercise in erasing her dignity and sealing her fate. The charges, adultery, incest, and treason, were grave, yet their foundation rested on the weakest of evidence, much of it likely fabricated or coerced. Witnesses' testimonies were riddled with inconsistencies, but their purpose was not to convince, but to confirm. Anne conducted herself with remarkable composure, refusing to admit guilt or beg for mercy. Her defense was limited by the constraints of the Tudor legal system and the overwhelming power wielded against her. She was not allowed a full counsel or the means to disprove the allegations adequately. The court proceeded with mechanical efficiency. Her guilt was assumed as a matter of course, a necessity to restore the fractured royal order. Public sentiment was mixed. Some believed the Queen was a victim of political machinations, others accepted the narrative imposed by the Crown. The trial became less a question of innocence or guilt and more a reaffirmation of power. To convict Anne was to reaffirm Henry VIII's sovereignty, his right to control both crown and church, and to sanction the religious transformations he had set in motion. The verdict was swift and unanimous. Guilty. The sentence, death by beheading, was pronounced with solemnity but delivered without compassion. The trial's outcome was inevitable. It was a formality and a drama choreographed to legitimize execution and dissuade dissent. Anne's fall from grace, from queen to condemned, was complete. Yet her silence and courage in the face of condemnation would echo through history as testimony to her strength. The sentence against Anne Boleyn was not simply an order to end a life. It was a command to perform ultimate submission in the shadow of death. Tudor law and custom dictated that even the condemned, especially a queen, was to express obedience to the king's justice before the final moment. For Anne, this meant she was compelled to thank the very men who had sentenced her, those who embodied the machinery of her destruction. This act was a grotesque inversion of justice, a spectacle of power forcing gratitude from the vanquished, eroding dignity one last time. The execution order was carried out with the meticulous solemnity that characterized Henry VIII's reign. In the hours before the execution, Anne was prepared physically and mentally for her final appearance. She reportedly chose to wear a red gown, a color rich with symbolism, interpreted variously as martyrdom, defiance, or royal dignity. Her hair, once hidden beneath a crown or veil, was now uncovered, framing a face marked by the toll of imprisonment but unbowed. The scene was set for a final public performance, the condemned queen, stripped of title and accused of betrayal, standing before the crowd not only to die, but to reaffirm the king's unassailable authority. Her forced expression of thanks was more than legal formality, it was a ritual of erasure and control. Anne's preparation for death revealed her complex psychology, a mixture of resignation, courage, and perhaps defiant grace. She knew that to refuse the mandated gratitude would risk harsher indignities, while compliance preserved a measure of agency in a situation designed to strip all agency away. The subtlety of this choice reveals the stark realities faced by those caught in the unforgiving nexus of monarchy, law, and spectacle. The day Anne Boleyn walked to the scaffold, London was cloaked in an uneasy silence, pierced occasionally by the murmurs of an expectant crowd. The air hung heavy, not just with spring's damp chill, but with the tension of a spectacle meant to assert absolute power. Anne's journey to the execution ground was not merely a physical procession, it was a ritual, a public drama scripted by those who sought to transform justice into theatre. The modest grey gown she wore belied the storm within. A woman condemned not only by law, but by the fragile politics that had once raised her. Anne's steps were steady, each footfall echoing on the cobblestones with a measured dignity that defied the humiliation imposed on her. Her hair, loose and flowing, caught the soft light, a stark contrast to the tightly bound figure of a condemned traitor. She ascended the scaffold with poise, the platform itself an altar where life and death converged in a final act of power. Her eyes scanned the sea of faces, some hostile, others somber, all witnesses to the ritual sacrifice of a queen. The executioner, a French swordsman brought in for his skill, stood apart, a silent instrument of mercy within a cruel design. Unlike the gruesome beheadings common in England, Anne's death was swift, precise, and deliberate. The sword's arc was clean, severing head from body in a single stroke, sparing her the prolonged agony that had marked so many Tudor executions. The crowd exhaled, some with relief, others with quiet reverence, as her body was lowered into the prepared grave, the last act of this tragic play complete. Yet even in death, Anne's performance endured. Her composure under unimaginable pressure, her forced expression of thanks, and the final grace of her beheading combined to transform her from a fallen queen into a martyr. Her death, intended to silence, became a voice, a whisper that would grow louder through the centuries, challenging the very foundations of power that had condemned her. Anne Boleyn's death was intended to close a chapter of turmoil and cement the supremacy of Henry VIII's will. Yet the ripples of her execution extended far beyond the scaffold. Politically, her removal cleared the path for Henry's subsequent marriages and his consolidation of the English Reformation, a seismic shift in religious and political power that would define the nation for centuries. But on a personal and cultural level, Anne's legacy became a site of conflict, memory, and myth-making. Her daughter, Elizabeth, born amid the storms of controversy and suspicion, inherited more than a crown. She inherited the shadows cast by her mother's rise and fall. Elizabeth's eventual reign as one of England's greatest monarchs would forever intertwine with the memory of Anne's tragic fate, her legitimacy both haunted and strengthened by her mother's martyrdom. Public opinion on Anne was fractured from the start. While the court sought to depict her as a morally fallen woman, whispers among commoners and some nobles suggested sympathy and sorrow. Over time, writers and poets recast Anne as a victim of ruthless politics rather than a scheming adulteress. Her story became a cautionary tale about the perils of ambition and the fragility of female power in a male-dominated world. The complex interplay of fact and fiction surrounding Anne Boleyn's life and death reflects broader cultural anxieties about gender, authority, and justice. Her enforced gratitude before execution symbolizes the coercive control monarchies exerted over bodies and narratives alike. Her story invites reflection on how history is shaped not just by events, but by who controls their telling. Anne Boleyn's final moments reveal a disturbing intersection of power and performance, where the sovereign's control extends not only over life and death, but over how death is experienced and narrated. The forced gratitude she expressed was not mere protocol. It was a ritualized submission, an enforced speech act designed to reaffirm royal authority even as her body was taken from her. This act, compelled in extremis, exposes the mechanisms by which power disciplines the body, scripting obedience in moments that should belong solely to personal dignity. Her execution was a theatrical spectacle calibrated to dissolve not just her life but her agency. The sovereign demanded silence or scripted speech, mastery over pain or acceptance of humiliation. In compelling a queen to thank her killers, the Tudor state transformed a violent death into a statement of sovereign invincibility, a message inscribed onto the flesh of its victim. It forced the vanquished to participate in their own erasure, rendering complicity the final act of dominance. This dynamic resonates beyond Tudor England. It exemplifies how bodies under political violence become sites of control, how execution is wielded not only as punishment, but as spectacle, and how rituals surrounding death can serve to mask brutality with the veneer of legitimacy. The tension between individual agency and systemic coercion is writ large in Anne's story, inviting reflection on how societies enforce conformity through fear and ritual. Her legacy challenges us to question, when does justice end and performance begin? When does political violence become a form of theatre? And how do those subjected to such violence reclaim agency in the face of systemic power? Anne's forced gratitude is not a sign of weakness, but a stark reminder of the costs of sovereignty wielded without restraint.